Today we have a special guest, Dr. Rhiannon Thomas from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. She does some amazing work to understand river ecology and the role of the freshwater pearl mussel in regulating water quality in Scotland's waterways. We got to spend some time with Dr. Thomas to understand her research, so let's dive in. So, to begin the interview, could you give us an overview of your research area and explain why studying freshwater mussels is so important?
Yeah, so I guess my research area more broadly is all things river related. So I'm interested in the flow of water in rivers, so the hydrology, in the geomorphology, so the sediment and what rivers look like, and also the ecology, so what lives in rivers, and kind of how all those things interact together. And then particularly the research on freshwater pearl mussels, I think, is important because they're an endangered species, and they're protected. And actually, here in Scotland, we've got almost half of the global population of freshwater pearl mussels. So I think it's really important that here in Scotland, we do as much as we can to find out things like what are their habitat requirements, how are they responding to changes in the environment, and basically what can we do to help conserve them.
Thank you. So it's fascinating that such an unassuming creature, which many of our viewers might not know existed, has such a
Yeah,
crucial role in our river systems.
absolutely. I mean, until I came to work in Glasgow University, I'd never heard of them before, and then sort of did a project where we were sort of mapping a river to look at the sediment in the river because of the importance of the pearl mussels in the river. And so that's how I got interested in pearl mussels, and have sort of kept research going with them ever since.
Yeah, because usually when we think of pearls, I think a lot of us would think of saltwater oysters. So,
Yeah.
what is the main biological difference between freshwater mussels and their saltwater counterparts, particularly when it comes to forming pearls?
So actually, both the saltwater, like marine mussels, and freshwater mussels can produce pearls. The main difference, sort of biologically, between the two are that, first of all, their habitat preferences. So the freshwater mussels obviously like rivers, lakes to live in, whereas the saltwater mussels prefer a saltwater environment. And then the other main difference is their reproductive strategy. So with the marine or the saltwater mussels, when the female mussel releases larvae, it's kind of free floating and it gets dispersed by the currents, and then it just eventually will settle, the larvae will settle on a substrate. With the freshwater mussel, and particularly the freshwater pearl mussel, they use a strategy called, or they use a host fish, and it's called parasitic larval stage. So they basically attach, um, the larvae attaches to a host fish, and then the fish disperses them within that river or lake. And we can talk a bit more about the life cycle of the mussel in a minute. But that's so the reproductive strategies between the two are very different, but they both can actually produce a pearl.
Oh, I didn't know that they could both produce the pearl.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
yeah, like you just said with the host fish. As I understand it, the mussels have a close dependency on other animals. Could you just walk us through the life cycle of the mussel and how other animals might attribute to their life?
Yep. So it's a really fascinating life cycle. And so basically the female mussel produces or will release larvae at a certain time of the year. And we think this is sort of temperature dependent. So it tends to be at the end of the summer, July, kind of August time. And the mussel releases millions and millions of larvae, tiny little larvae, and we call them glachidia. And they look like, if you look under in a microscope, they look like a little mussel. They've got two valves, but the valves are kind of open. And then the female mussel releases that larvae into the river, into the water, and then a host fish. And in Scotland, it's either a salmon or a trout. then will swim by and inhales these glycidia, the larvae, and they then attach the mussel shells sort of fasten tight onto the gill filaments of the fish. And that's what's called parasitic phase because they live then attached to the fish like all through the winter. And then in the spring, when they're a bit bigger, then they drop off their fish and they have to then land in sort of clean, kind of sandy, gravelly substrate. And they bury down, and so they live within the substrate in the riverbed for about, well, between like 5 and 7 years or so. And then when they're about sort of 10 or 15, they're classed as an adult. And then they live sort of on the substrate of the riverbed as a filter feeder. Um, and then will grow, and then the female mussel again will release the glycidia. And so it's a really interesting cycle that the mussel, in order for the mussel to survive, it depends on a good host fish population.
What is it about the mussel that allows it to form a pearl?
Yeah.
And does its environment play a role?
Not so much so basically the formation of a pearl is like a natural defense mechanism for the mussels. So what happens is they might have so an irritant comes in, so it might be like a tiny grain of sand or a parasite, and so the mussel's reaction to that is in case that little particle impacts their soft tissue, they secrete nacre, it's called, or mother of pearl. So they secrete that around the irritant, say it's a sand grain, and that sort of coats and forms layers, and that's what forms the pearl. So they sort of it's like a protection mechanism for themselves. So not every mussel or oyster for that matter will form a pearl.
So it's just like a trauma response then.
Yeah, yeah,
So I've read that freshwater mussels are considered to be bioindicators of river health. Could you explain what this means and why it's important?
yeah. So the freshwater pearl mussel is kind of known as a keystone species, and what that means is that it's really important for the environment it lives in because lots of other species then depend on it. So what the pearl mussels do is they filter feed, so they filter out a lot of the organic material in rivers, and so they basically clean the rivers. And they can filter up to 50 liters of water a day, so they're really effective. And but they need a really clean environment, so they're very prone to pollution and high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus. It's called eutrophication. So they really need a clean environment. So if you've got freshwater pearl mussels in your river, you know you've got a really healthy river. But it's not just, I guess the next thing to then check is you may have pearl mussels in your river, but do you have a good population? Are they a functional population, we call them? So are they producing juvenile mussels? And then you know if you've got adult mussels and juvenile mussels in your river, you know you've got a healthy river.
Yeah, thank you. So as more contamination occurs and our climate is changing, what impact do
Yeah.
you think we'll see on the population of mussels and the quality of their pearls in general, in terms of things like pollution and temperature shifts?
Yeah, so they're really sensitive to pollution. Like I've mentioned, they're sensitive to higher levels of nitrogen and phosphorus, which you can get from fertilizers, agricultural runoff. Really sensitive to any kind of habitat degradation, so things like any river engineering happening in the river. And they're really sensitive to temperature. And not just the freshwater pearl mussel, but their host fish, the salmon and trout, are really sensitive to temperature. So as our river water temperatures increase because of climate change, um, we're likely, if we don't take measures to protect them, we're likely to see a reduction in salmon and trout populations, and then potentially a reduction in pearl mussel populations. So it's important, we can do things like plant trees along our riverbank, for example, to increase shade to try and reduce those river water temperatures.
Yeah, thank you. So I haven't quite thought about the fact that the things we do don't necessarily affect the mussels directly. It could be through that host fish, which then means that their population decreases.
Yeah, yeah. Because they have that such close relationship. Yeah, totally. So anything that happens to a detrimental that happens to the host fish will have that knock-on impact to the pearl mussel.
Okay, so because of all these issues and a change in climate and human activities, if mussels were to disappear from river systems, what kind of ripple effect might we expect to see?
Yeah, so I guess you've got, because they're a keystone species and they're cleaning that water for other organisms, you might find then that, those other organisms that need a kind of cleaner water environment also start to decline. And maybe you'll get other organisms coming in that are sort of more suited to siltier or, lower oxygen levels. So you'll end up getting a change in the sort of community, the ecological community in those rivers. And I think, yeah, I mean, they're an endangered protected species, so I think we need to do everything we can to keep them so we don't end up in the position where we're losing them from our river systems. Yeah. I mean, they used to be quite widespread in England and Wales, and there's now only a few populations left in England and Wales. And in Scotland, the populations are declining. So it's really key that we try and conserve the populations that we do have left.
Yeah, definitely. What conservation efforts are currently in progress to sustain those that we've got remaining?
So there's different kinds of measures that are kind of happening all across Scotland. So you can first of all you can try and restore the habitat. So you make the habitat as suitable as possible for mussels. So they're quite picky. They quite like, certain flow depths, certain velocities, certain sediment, certain substrates. Um, not like we talked about, they're sensitive to phosphates and nitrogen. So if you can reduce the amount of pollutants like that are entering your system, if you can reduce the amount of siltation happening. So for example, in rivers where you've got pearl mussels, if you can stop sort of cattle coming right down onto the riverbank where they might sort of stir up the sediment and release fine sediment into the river, if you can kind of stop that happening, so all of these things are sort of improving the habitat, which will then improve the conditions for the mussel. So that's kind of one approach. Other approaches are things like translocations, we call them. So that's maybe moving mussel populations that are doing really well in one river. So moving a portion of that population into rivers where they're doing, much less well, so that you can try and increase populations in others. And so this translocation of populations from river to river has been another approach people have used. Um, and then the other thing is to rear juveniles. So you kind of help the process, the natural process. So this is where you might take into a laboratory or a rearing facility, and you might hold the female mussels there. They'll release the glycidia, and you've got the host fish there too. So all this is sort of in a more controlled environment. And then once you have the juvenile mussels, they're grown and sort of looked after in a rearing facility, and you try and reduce all the risks and all the things that could impact negatively the population. And when they're at a stage that they're a bit older and they can be, the ultimate aim is then to put them back into the river so they can grow as an adult and be in the river eventually. So there's various rearing facilities, in the UK and across Europe, where lots of researchers are trying to sort of figure out what the best way and what the best techniques are of rearing the juveniles, but always with the view to, eventually we want to put them back into the real world, into real rivers. But those rivers need to be in a state that they can that they can then cope with those mussels, and the mussels can thrive in the rivers. So it's maybe the habitat restoration that I talked about, various river restoration projects are ongoing to kind of enable that to happen.
If the mussels were to disappear from the river systems, is there any way that we could perhaps mimic what they do for the rivers? Or would it mean that the ecosystem, their community, would collapse?
I guess you've got. I guess there's other species of mussels that potentially you could bring in that do the same thing in terms of filter feeding. Um, but I think the freshwater pearl mussel, just in Scotland as well, has a sort of real historical and cultural significance as well as an ecological significance. So I think it's really important that you try and keep that species as well. And it's a really long-lived species. So some mussels can live up to 100, 120 years. So this again is one of the main differences between a freshwater mussel and a marine mussel, is that the freshwater mussels live for much longer.
Yeah, thank you. So, if one of our viewers was influenced to help this conservation today, is there any way that they could take part, either like individually or as a group?
So because there's a sort of a bit of a complication with that, because they're a protected species and they're endangered. You it's illegal to disturb or move a freshwater pearl mussel unless you've got a specific license to do that. But there's lots of things, that you can do to sort of help, like making sure the rivers in your home village or town are clean and they're not being littered. You can, if you live in a place where there are freshwater pearl mussels in your river, you can illegal pearl fishing still happens, where people come along and will just scoop up lots of mussels and kill them to look to see if they've got any pearls. So just being vigilant, and if you see something that looks a bit strange in your river, like an individual or a group of people in the river that maybe are sort of collecting up lots of the mussels, then yeah, reporting that to the police, because it's classed as a wildlife crime, because they're protected. But just maybe seeing what organizations like Nature Scott or various different rivers trusts, they might have events or information, sessions that you can go along to and find a bit more about. And if there's something particular in the area you live in that you can contribute to, then that's a good way of doing that through sort of more local river trusts.
Thank you very much. That's all the questions I have. Thank you for really enlightening conversation and sharing your knowledge and passion with us. If any of our listeners want to get in touch with you, is there any way they can contact you if they have any more
Yeah,
questions?
yeah, my email, so rhian.thomas@glasgow.ac.uk.
Well, there you have it. The amazing research of Dr. Rhiannon Thomas on the role that the freshwater pearl mussel plays in maintaining and regulating the delicate river ecosystem in Scotland. If you have any more questions, feel free to reach out to Dr. Thomas directly. If you liked this video, let us know in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel to get more just like it in your feed automatically.